instead of all of that, he says that Jesus appeared to him alive and with power, and that's why he changed the way that he was thinking. Okay. So if there's nothing, yeah, Liz.
So I think it's interesting about Jesus' resurrection that he wasn't the only one raised from the dead. And I think sometimes we forget about that too.
In terms of like who else?
In terms of the other people that he had raised coming along. So imagine with the Waco situation, you've got the guy and his followers for years and said, oh yeah, he raises people from the dead, he raises people from the dead, he raises people from the dead. And then they're like, he raised from the dead. And you'd be like, what are you talking about? Like, none of this makes sense. So it's like this escalation that I think sometimes we forget about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because living in today's world, we're like, yeah, if someone said you raised from the dead, we wouldn't think a thing about it. But with having that experience, at least there was like a semi-basis for it. It wasn't way out of left field, like if the Waco situation you mentioned.
Right, absolutely. And so you're talking about this idea of Jesus set the stage for this to happen. You know, it goes back to the question that we talked about at the end of the introduction to this packet of he established this context of claiming to perform miracles, of making divine claims about himself. And so, right, it's not some random thing. He's pushing us to look in this direction, and then something along those lines happens, right? It's not out of the dark, out of the left field. Yeah, so thanks about bringing that up. Okay, so number 3, is there any evidence that anything like this even happened? Somebody taken, whether it's the disciples or somebody else. Number 3, is there any evidence of someone stealing the body anywhere?
The body's gone.
The body's gone, so that's one thing. So something happened to it. But is there any record anywhere of somebody claiming, oh, we know who did it, except for obviously Matthew 28, or, you know, incidental details somewhere that says, oh, well, somebody must have taken it? No, there's not. The silence is the right answer. Is there anything that opposes that idea? To say the fact that, you know, stealing the body would be very unlikely, or that that's not what happened?
They were just all very confused. And they were very confused.
Yeah, they're very confused.
And they didn't know what had happened.
Right, again, yeah. So when our spiritual ancestors are writing down this story, they tell us that the leaders, the pillars of the foundation, the cornerstone of the church, when all these things happen, they're confused. Right? And if you're going to make up a story to promote your cause, to say that your key leaders were confused and didn't understand and actually were ignorant of all these things, it's not a very good way to go about it. Yeah, so there's that. Is there anything else that you can think of?
I mean, like we've said, like, it was a high-profile death. They're in a big city, and they posted guards at the tomb. So the odds that a random group of people would be able to get in and steal the body were very slim, and the odds that they would be able to do it and not one person saw anything is absurd.
Right. So there's a lot. So we talked about that idea of the Jerusalem factor, right? The disciples are claiming all of this in the same exact spot where it happened. That makes it really unlikely that they would have been able to pull off a lie. And then, yeah, there's all these claims that the Jews put the temple guard at the tomb, that, you know, it was a high-profile death and people knew about it. And so to say that something like someone stealing the body happened, you have to go then the extra mile to show that that is there. You can't just say that, right? You have to come up with some kind of proof for it. And actually, then you'd have to say, okay, well, I have to prove that there were no guards at the tomb. I would have to prove that, you know, people didn't care about where he was buried and nobody was paying attention to all these kinds of things that just don't make sense, right? And so,
we have a record that there were guards at the tomb.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. If somebody is trying to say that someone stole the body, then you have to disprove all of that stuff. Right. Absolutely. And then this is just kind of a question I was thinking about. Yeah.
because they wanted, to take more of a military stance and all. They weren't necessarily disciples of Jesus. And if they wanted to mess with the Jewish council, like you said, a joke, you know, it has no practical use, but I could see him saying it wouldn't be funny if we. So there were people that would have been motivated to try to make the council look bad, but that motivated, I don't know.
And then it brings us back to the same exact spot where we have to say, how did somebody do it
Yeah, you still have
with
the
the
same
guard?
issues,
You got to answer the same
practicality.
questions.
Why?
Yeah, the story about Jesus and his ultimate fate of crucifixion was not really unique to people of that day. This was just another, from their perspective, another pretend prophet to add to the list. There's not anybody who would really have a good reason to do it or the wherewithal, to pull something like this off, unless we're going to come up with all kinds of, explanations extra to this. And, the incidental details also point to the fact that the body was there and then somebody moved it in a very odd fashion, right? The wrappings were there. Why would you carry the body out naked? That's what would have had to happen. Incidental detail is, all of the wrappings were still there. Moving on with the story, and it's like, wait, hold on a second. So if somebody went into the tomb to take Jesus' body, they took the time to unwrap him, and then carry out this corpse, apparently with nothing on it. The Jews did not bury their dead, for the most part. They didn't bury their dead with any valuables. So it's not unwrapping Jesus to try to steal his stuff. Right? At that point, there's, ritual uncleanness, and there's the fact that, they would wonder if he was starting to stink and all kinds of things. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. There's a lot that would have to be explained. There's no riches. They would be facing a guard, so the question is just why would anyone want or try to do that? And we have no evidence of anybody trying to do that. Okay. Yes?
I think kind of another funny thing about the whole, why would they unwrap them? It also says that they were, folded neatly. So even if I was stealing the body and I wanted to take the stuff off for whatever reason, why would I then fold the stuff?
Yeah. I've never robbed a grave, but
Why would
I assumed that I would want to get in and get out as fast as I could, and not take the time to do some housekeeping.
Right.
And that's just another one of those things that is just stated sort of matter of fact. There's not a big point made about it, but it causes you to think, okay, something weird happened. Something weird. There was a lot of care in taking this body out of, however it left the tomb, there was a lot of care taken in it leaving the tomb. And grave robbing usually doesn't look like that, right? It's burglary. It's breaking and entering and taking things like that. So again, this is all to say that it just puts a lot more questions up when we start trying to say, well, it was somebody else that stole the body. It doesn't disagree with any of the facts. All it does is say that the tomb was empty for some other reason, and then there's more that has to be explained if we start saying things like this. Anything else we want to talk about before we move on? Are we starting to get a feel for kind of how we're moving through this and kind of asking the core questions about what it's saying and seeing how well it fits with the evidence? Is that making sense? Yeah. It's making sense to the young females in here, at least, I can tell, because they're the ones chiming in, guys. And Greg. Sorry. Okay. Anyway, so let's go. So, the last line, well, one of the last main lines of a claim would be, well, Jesus didn't actually die. It would just say that maybe it looked like he's dead. Everybody thought he was dead, but actually he wasn't actually dead. And then he came out of the tomb, and the rest is history, as they say. So it's a little tricky, and you'll understand in a second why. For the most part, nobody has tried to say this in a long, long time. But in another way, there are certain faith traditions that under certain interpretations will say that this is what happened. And we'll look at this quote here in a minute. But sometimes it was argued that Jesus didn't actually die, but it just seemed like he did. And one of the most famous names for this is called swoon theory. Somebody define the word swoon for us? Yeah, fainting, like, oh. We don't talk about that much, but it's the idea that Jesus would have fainted or swooned while on the cross, and that he was unconscious while they took him down and his body was processed and then put in the tomb, but then at some point he regained consciousness in the tomb, unwrapped himself, opened the door, walked out, and then presented himself to everyone after he was strong enough to, and they were convinced that he had been raised from the dead. Now, I'm seeing a lot of smiles on your faces, and you kind of see what the general consensus about this idea is. But everybody thought that he was dead, but he was not dead. You know, it's just, even in what we just said, to say that somebody in Jesus' state was able in a dark tomb to come to himself and then get out, that's a lot to ask. I mean, you saw those doors, a few 100 pounds, and Jesus didn't die, but he was close enough to death that everybody thought that he was dead and he could do all of that. So that's just one thing to talk about. But I want to share that, so certain Muslims will say that this is what happened according to the Quran. And I did do some digging into, you know, what different Quranic commentators say about this, and it's divided in opinion. But there are some of the Islamic faith that would say that this idea of Jesus not actually dying is what happened. So I provided you with a quotation about this, because this would maybe be the most likely place that you would encounter this sort of claim, is somebody from the Islamic faith with this particular interpretation. And so I want to provide you just so the awareness of this. I don't think I put this on the PowerPoint, because you already have it. Right. So can somebody read for us this quotation starting at the bottom of 3 and then continuing to the top of 4? Any volunteers to read the Quran in Bible class? Zach.
And for their saying, surely we killed the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, the messenger of God, yet they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it seemed like to them, surely those who differ about him are indeed in doubt about him. They have no knowledge about him, only the following of conjecture. Certainly they did not kill him. No, God raised him to himself. God is mighty wise.
Okay. So that is the passage from the Quran that, you know, states this. And there are multiple interpretations from Muslims about this. So some say that, yes, this teaches that Jesus appeared to be dead, but he didn't actually die. Some say, and this is more of one of the official teachings, as far as I understand, that Jesus was somehow switched with somebody else by God. And that, you know, it looked like it was Jesus, but it wasn't actually Jesus, because if you look at the end of this quotation, it says, God raised him to himself. So the consensus is the fact that God took Jesus to heaven, but he didn't actually die. And that is agreed upon, but as to the details, there's where the disagreements are. But as you can see from this, it's, who is this quoting at the beginning of this passage here? Who's saying, surely we killed, and so on? Yeah, so this is the Quran quote, like purporting to quote the Jewish people and saying, we killed the Messiah, Jesus, the messenger of God. And then it goes on to say they think that's what happened, but they didn't actually kill him. You know, they didn't actually crucify him either, and that's where the idea sometimes of the switching comes in. But it only seemed like they killed him. And so this is, as I said, probably the most likely place today that I think you would come up against this. And I don't want to get into a whole critical discussion of the Quran at this point, although I am willing to do that after class about what I think a lot of this points out. But before we go into questions, did I see some hands up? Yeah.
So, is the reason, I guess, I don't know, I don't understand this theory quite as much, because, so the swoon theory is to explain Jesus coming back alive without it being
Without it being a resurrection.
resurrection. Why does the Quran not believe in resurrection, or?
It does not believe that Jesus was resurrected in that way.
Okay, I didn't know.
Yeah. Jesus was a prophet, but he was not anything else. Yeah. And so this is just one example of like a swoon theory. The most popular one was actually by some German guy in the 1800s. And he was the one that really put forward the idea of, it seemed like Jesus was dead, but once he was put in the tomb, then he came back to life. And so the Quran is just one sort of angle on, possibly thinking this. And there are others as well that have nothing to do with the Quran. Andrew, did you have your hand up too, Addie? Or? No? Okay, so you're saying.
It seemed like when I was seeing people who were proposing this idea, it goes along with people who also say that the Gospels add details after the fact that didn't happen.
Yeah.
Because it is admittable that crucifixion was an inefficient way of killing someone. Crucifixion was designed to keep a person alive more so than to kill them right away.
Yeah, it's not a firing squad.
Right,
for sure.
and Pilate was surprised that Jesus was already dead. That detail is given in the Gospels. So the argument would go, okay, him getting stabbed in the side to prove that he's dead, that the apostles added that later so that people wouldn't ask that kind of question. But, somehow they gamed Jewish law to get Jesus taken down early, and it was a plan that, Jesus would pretend to be dead, or they would pass it off as he was dead. And then they rushed to bury him before sundown of that same evening, so there was little time to confirm that he was dead, plus the lack of modern medicine, the methods that we use to confirm that someone was dead. So I've seen the argument go like that it's a combination of the Gospels added details to make it seem more like Jesus was really dead, and this all happened really quickly, and crucifixion wasn't that good at killing people. Most people died of exposure or dehydration, really, if they were crucified. So people kind of take that route to point to this.
And to some degree, that's what Islam would say too, is that the Bible's corrupt, and it's added different things, and so that's not all that uncommon. But I want you to keep in mind, because that can start to get your head spin a little bit. What we looked at with the 5 facts are what even in a scholar of the New Testament who is a Muslim would agree with. Right? These are unanimous facts that everyone agrees on. That doesn't mean that people on the internet aren't going to deny them, right? But anybody who's done any research and reading about this in the mainstream, you're going to find fringe stuff all the time. But in the mainstream, even a Muslim who studies the Bible academically would agree with these facts that we've talked about, right? So let's get to question number 1, and this will kind of illustrate why I'm pointing that out here. So I said, there's multiple problems with the claim that Jesus didn't die by crucifixion. And so looking at facts 1 and 2, what seem to be the biggest problems to you? Because I think there are maybe several things that we could bring up here. So what did we think for this? What do you think are the biggest problems about the claim that Jesus did not die by crucifixion?
I think the fact that you had professional soldiers that were very adept at killing say that he was dead. I mean, it would be like a Navy SEAL killing somebody, and then somebody saying, well, he really didn't kill him.
Yeah.
I mean, they were very adept at their job.
The Romans knew how to crucify. And that is very clear from history. They knew what they were doing. They knew how to drag it out as long as they wanted. They knew how to end it when they wanted to. And so that is definitely one layer to it, is to claim that there was all these mistakes that don't happen otherwise. What else? Andrew?
To me, the biggest problem is eventually Jesus is going to go on to die again, if this is the true story.
Yeah.
And where do we have...
Probably pretty soon, too.
What happens to the account that's missing of Jesus' second, or in their view, actual death, which is sure to follow if he didn't really die in the first place?
Yeah, and so again, we got to come up with all this extra information to explain what we're talking about. And that's the other thing of, too, you know, Andrew gave this example of people say, well, it's part of this and part of this. And combining different theories together does not make your theory more probable, it makes it less probable. Because you have all of these different things that you have to explain. So if you've ever been in math class and you take a probability and you multiply it by a probability, does it get bigger or smaller, more probable or less probable?
More probable.
Less. So if you take 0.5, 50%, and multiply it by 0.5, 50%, you get 25%. So when you're trying to put all of these things together, it actually makes it less likely. And so that's kind of an example. You then have so much more that you have to explain. For one, to deny the facts that we're talking about. So what else are we thinking? Brace, did you?
Well, I mean, you're going to have to at some point deal with the fact that, and I mean, that's one of the things that I think is important to point out to Islamic friends who believe this, is the Quran also teaches that Jesus was a prophet and a good teacher and someone to listen to, albeit not the Messiah, but he was a good prophet. Jesus claims that he was going to die and be buried and rise from the dead. He cannot be both. He can't be one who states those things about himself and then have somehow fraudulently passed off his resurrection. So, I mean, those things don't fit. They don't match.
So from my understanding, the response to that would be, well, the Bible's not telling the true story about Jesus. You know, all of those claims that he purported to make are not the real record, which is a whole other discussion, obviously. And the Quran says that he was not crucified, and therefore he was not crucified. I mean, a lot of us would do that with the Bible, right? So there's a lot of layers, you know, to these kind of difficulties, which is why I said I'm willing to talk about this after class, just not right now. So another thing that I wanted to point out about this is what we talked about with the information in fact number 1, you know, those authors that we looked at saying that Jesus was a real person, Josephus, Tacitus, what did they say happened to Jesus? He was crucified. We look at fact number 2 and just why it is so universal that everyone agrees that Jesus was crucified. And I'm not just stating this for me. If you look at ancient historians, they will say Jesus being crucified is about the surest thing in ancient history that we have. So to say that that didn't happen, we got to throw out everything else that we know too, because that's pretty straightforward, that Jesus was crucified. And so that's why I want to point us back to the fact that the facts that we talked about are universal bedrock things that anybody who knows what they're talking about agrees on. And so, yeah, to say that Jesus didn't die, that opens up so many more cans of worms that then we have to talk about.
Is it disingenuous, though, to say that crucifixion has to imply death?
It usually did. Or they would stop it and then you'd get thrown in a ditch and you would die that way.
Just the very nature of the crucifixion, we think that it would be impossible to survive.
Yeah. Well, what Andrew's talking about too, I think would be answered maybe by this next question. So number 2. So remember, the idea is, from whatever viewpoint, that Jesus didn't actually die. It just looked like he did. But then at some point after he's revived, he presents himself to the disciples as having been raised from the dead and having conquered death. Could seeing a crucified but not dead Jesus explain the sincere belief of the disciples that they saw him risen from the dead? Put yourself in their shoes. Jesus was taken as close to death as possible but did not die. And then in a few days you see him again. What is he probably going to look like? Right. are you going to walk away from that encounter thinking this is the man who's conquered death? Because that's what has to happen, right? If Jesus didn't actually die, then he has to present himself to the disciples somehow as having conquered death while looking like a literal corpse. I mean, I don't know how he would drag himself out of the tomb and then still probably dragging himself to the disciples that they would walk away and say, yes, this is the Lord of the universe. You know, God's Messiah, all of these things. So to say that he didn't actually die does not explain their sincere belief at all, right? Because what did they say convinced them? That they saw what? They saw, Jesus alive again, his wounds, they ate with him, all of these things. And if Jesus had been taken to the door of death and then just dropped there, in what universe would they walk away with that idea? And so this is one of the reasons that this one has been sort of dead for a long time. And I want to share one of the most famous quotes about this. So this is another German guy. You're seeing the pattern here. Another German guy from like the 1900s. And this is what is considered with putting the nail in the coffin on the Jesus didn't actually die idea. So this is a guy named D.F. Strauss who didn't actually believe the resurrection, but said this nonetheless. It is impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, the tomb, who crept about weak and ill, wanting medical treatment, who required bandaging, strengthening, and indulgence, and who still at last yielded to his sufferings, could have given to his disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave, the Prince of Life, an impression which lay at the bottom of their future ministry. Such a resuscitation could only have weakened the impression which he had made upon them in life and in death. At the most, could only have given it an I always trip on this, elegiac voice, but could by no possibility have changed their sorrow into enthusiasm, or could have elevated their reverence into worship. He's saying, how could the disciples, seeing a half-dead Jesus, think that this is the guy? And he said that would actually undermine everything that he had taught them and done with them while he was alive. They'd say, this guy's a sham. Right? And so that's one of the things. And with number 3, it's kind of the same idea. Does a Jesus who is half dead but then tries to come convince his disciples that he had been resurrected, does that fit with the Jesus that we know just even from general history? No. He is one of the greatest moral teachers ever, no matter who you talk to. And that doesn't fit. To say that he then tried to pull this stunt on them and say, hey, actually, guys, I'm not dead. I was raised from the grave. That does not fit the picture. That just adds more questions. Salem?
Kind of to that point, and then also what Andrew had said earlier, I feel like this claim takes God out of the picture.
That's what they're all trying to do.
That's kind of the point. But then essentially, kind of like Andrew was saying, you still have, if you're going to say this and still claim that the disciples believed, even if he was half dead, the ascension still would kind of have to happen for them to take away, like, oh yeah, he was God, or he just like randomly disappeared. But even if that happened, I'd be like, okay, well, he went and died in a ditch or left, or you know what I mean? I don't feel like your automatic assumption would be, well, God did this for him. You know, it's taking God out of it, but also you still kind of have to keep him in it if you do want to claim that they had this belief still.
Well, maybe not. So, like with what Andrew is saying, right? Jesus would still have to die if he didn't die by crucifixion. And so, taking God out of the picture, which is what all of these are trying to do, right? Jesus dies some other way, maybe back in Nazareth or something. And then the disciples have to then put this whole conspiracy together to talk about the death and the resurrection and the ascension. So then we're just back at square one, having to explain all that again. To say, okay, well, Jesus didn't die by crucifixion. He died some other way. And then the disciples all got together and they decided, how are we going to spin this to make Jesus who we want him to be? And then we're back and trying to explain the conspiracy. It doesn't solve anything. It just makes more problems, is really what a lot of this is. The fact is that there's no way that them seeing Jesus in this state could have given them the implication that he was who he was claiming to be. Right? As this guy says, that would erase all of their faith in him. To see this man who's hobbling along, barely hanging on, is now trying to tell us that he's the Son of God. I don't think so. They were already confused and probably angry as it was, and I think this would have just been the death of it. Do we have any questions about any of that? So again, this is kind of like the heart, what's considered the nail in the coffin a while back. And because it just doesn't explain what the disciples believed, their sincerity to take it to death, and all the things that they were talking about. And so we'll stop there, and then we'll finish this one, picking up with like question 4 on Sundays. So be prepared to finish that, and then go through this idea of the hallucination. So anything else before we close for the night?
I'd like to ask a question.
Okay, I might not have an answer.
On the people who have been raised from the dead, Jesus was